Everyone, to the April installment of the Centerville, Iowa Memories podcast. We are very excited today to have Enfys McMurry, author of the new book on the crash of Continental Flight 11 that happened in this area in 1962. So, welcome, Enfys.
Oh, Lisa, it's always a joy to be with you and do anything in terms of Centerville memories, because this particular memory of Continental Flight 11 is embedded in so many people's minds, because the date that it happened was May the 22nd, 1962, and it was a Tuesday, and it was at night that it happened. To me, the striking thing about Continental Flight 11 is it's the first bombing of a luxury passenger jet airliner anywhere in the world. It's the first one. Furthermore, it's the first suicide bombing of any passenger aircraft anywhere in the world. And yet this story's been forgotten. Now, you may ask straight at the upshot, why has it been forgotten? Well, I found out in all my research, exactly 6 days after Continental Flight 11 happened here, with all the world press, their focus right on Centerville and Putnam County, Missouri, where the actual wreckage actually landed. All of a sudden, there was another Boeing 707. See, this was a new aircraft in 1962, just super luxurious. There was another 707 accident, and this happened at Orly Airport in Paris. Now, this wasn't a bomb. This certainly wasn't a suicide bomb. What we know about it, and I have researched all of that, something was technically wrong with that 707. The pilot realized it and tried to abort the flight. I think there were about 121 people on board, except for 2 flight attendants who were flung free of the debris. Everybody on board was killed. Furthermore, about 61 of those people, I should look up the exact number, about 61 of those passengers were Americans, and they weren't just Americans, they were very wealthy Americans, members of the Atlanta, Georgia Art Association. They had just completed 3 weeks dream tour of all the art galleries and all the places where magnificent art was being sold. And they were buying purchases. The purchases I don't think were on the flight, but they were buying them to bring them back to this magnificent art gallery that is in Atlanta, Georgia to this day. The world press immediately switched off from this part of the world. They immediately started following what was happening with the Paris crash and the Atlanta effect of it. And guess what? Something we're all used to, I think. We became flyover country again. Well, it's time this story was told in detail. Have people told the story? Well, there have been several people that have written wonderful articles, and that is all included. In fact, I dedicate the book to the people. Dwayne Crawford, retired major from Putnam County, lived in Unionville, and he came to teach in Unionville High School, heard people talk about this crash. He did magnificent 4 long detailed articles. And of course, quite naturally, he focused on the Unionville side of the story, the Putnam County side of the story. Well, I wanted to know everything because I knew that the actual bomb had gone off over Lake Wapello in Davis County. And there was a 40-mile trail of airline debris, a door that said to be open and closed on landing and taking off. There were blood on sandwiches, blood on blankets. I mean, it was a horrific event, but it started in Iowa. And the flight, what I should say first of all, okay, Continental Flight 11 was a planned, scheduled flight. And it was flying from Chicago O'Hare to Los Angeles, California, but it had a required stop in Kansas City. I've managed, and I start the book off this way. I'm tracking the moment that the plane took off from Chicago O'Hare. It took off at 8:35 p.m. The actual bomb went off. I've got the conversation between the pilot, a wonderful man, a 51-year-old, everything you read about him, what a good man he was, and 51-year-old Captain Freddie Gray. He was in charge. I've got his conversation. I found it. I've got his conversation between himself and ground control, how it passed from Aurora, Illinois, after he'd taken off from O'Hare. He asks to find out about the weather because, hey, it's May. And those of us that live in this area in May, we know what weather can be like, and huge storms and everything. So he checked into the storms. And because of the storms, when this plane did disintegrate at 9:17 and 7 seconds over, it must have been just at the edge of Lake Wapello. And people have asked me, how do you know that it went off there? And of course, it was up at 39,000 feet, so we know we're not exactly specific. But the sheriff of Davis County found bloody clothes and other remains right there. So I therefore give credit that the bomb actually went off over Lake Wapello in Davis County. But then there was, by the way, I have a friend, a wonderful friend called Jean Harrington Fowler. And Jean, she told me that she heard this most enormous noise that actually knocked her to the ground at that time at night. And she lived with her husband, Dwight, at a farm pretty close to the edge of Lake Wapello, but actually it's in Appanoose County. All right, so this explosion happened. 40 miles then of debris. Well, it was dark. Nobody saw the debris immediately. Some people had heard the sound, not many. And 4 minutes after the actual explosion, of course, there are people in Putnam County that do hear the sound. We know there was a huge flash of light, and people came forward to tell me their experiences. Marjorie Jones, who was the telephone operator in Cincinnati, she actually was deceased, but she did a wonderful interview for the Iowegian describing this huge flash of blue light. She described it as blue. And here she was, sitting ready to make the telephone calls come in through the night. And of course, they were going to as soon as people found out about this. And then, of course, this lovely man, Junior Claude Johnson, he's the very first person in this community that came forward when he knew I was doing this story. He was getting ready to lock up the Shields gas station right across from the House Black Kettle Cafe. And he was with his good friend, and all of a sudden this terrific flash, and he turned to his friend and said, "Can you believe that? There's not a cloud in the sky, and look at that lightning." Marjorie Jones immediately doubted it could be lightning because it lit up the tops of the rooftops of the houses and the buildings just for, of course, a split second. And immediately her phone rang, and it was Virg Allison from Cincinnati. And she said, "Oh, I saw this huge flash. I could see everything in the sky." She said, "What was it?" Well, nobody knew, but about 4 minutes later, the phone calls are coming in again to Marjorie Jones. One man saying, "What was that? Where was that car crash?" She said, "Well, I know nothing." But then a few people in Appanoose County, specifically in Unionville, began to hear a noise because, of course, it was 4 minutes later, and we all know that sound travels slower than light. Soon, nobody knew it because it was so dark. And the FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration, and the FBI, all these different organizations, they knew something horrible had happened. And we know that the radar operators in Kansas City and in Waverly, just north of Waterloo, they were all triangulating their information with maps to find out, where could this crash possibly be if it was a crash. Of course, the assumption at first was it was the storm, because there had been hideous storms threatening of tornadoes and everything in this area. So for a long time, until the FBI came in here and started working and looking at the research, did they realize it was not a storm at all, but it was something else. Now, what about Centerville? Eventually the news reaches Centerville, And when the news breaks in Centerville, we have a description that says all hell broke loose when they realized the person who had first seen anything was this lovely man traveling up Highway 5. And he saw a big chunk of metal in the dark in the middle of the road. Cars were driving around it. But he got out, picked it up, and looked at it in the light of his headlights of his car. And he said, I think this is from some kind of aircraft. I asked him, I interviewed Leo Craver, that's this wonderful man. I interviewed him at least 3 or 4 times. I said, how'd you know it was from a piece of an aircraft? He said, well, it was in the Second World War. I was in the Air Army Corps, and I was stationed in Panama Canal because he said it was a very dangerous area that enemies would try to attract. So he said, I'd gone out to a lot of air crashes, and I was in the medical part. So he said I had to deal with victims if there were victims there. But he said the reason I knew that chunk of metal right in the middle of Highway 5 was one simple reason: the rivets. I knew the rivets as I ran my fingers in the dark over that. I knew. Well, of course, that's the first sign that something awful has happened. And at that moment, we know all hell broke loose and people started moving and exercising, and they started gathering together, and the people in Centerville they turned out of their beds like 200 straight off, and they started going to the spot where Leo had found that piece of metal, which was right about the X-line turnoff on Highway 5. Just to be complicated for a writer like me, by the way, it was then known as Highway 60, and that, just to be complicated, of course, because every time I say Highway 5, which is what it is now, everybody knows, well, it was right at the X-line turnoff that Leo had found this chunk of metal. And that's what started the whole search. Well, the search went on for about 5 hours. People didn't know where it was. Different people were wading through mud and water because there'd been storms all day. And leading the whole group, of course, was Dr. Ritter. Now, I never knew Dr. Ritter, but I've got to tell you, there's a lot about him. I would love him if I knew him. Dr. Ritter didn't put up with fools, and he could take charge. Furthermore, in the Second World War, Dr. Ritter had already trained as a surgeon when he was called up and sent to the Pacific, and he was handling crash after crash. He knew exactly what to do. So here they all are then, standing up, all of them from Centerville, and they're moving down the highway, but other people are now crossing. They're crossing from Highway 5 south of Cincinnati because they're following this southwest trail of the debris. Well, of course, at this time, people in Putnam County who'd heard the sound, they didn't know what it was. It was only about midnight when in Unionville, Missouri, the phone calls started going around. People were listening to the radio. They were hearing that Charlie DePew was being interviewed on national radio programs. He was interviewing, and he was following the trail, describing the situation. Well, about midnight, these phone calls were registering now in Putnam County, and the sheriff of Putnam County, Mr. Fowler, he was contacted with his lovely wife. They were playing cards right across the road from where the messages were really being delivered into the power station. And he immediately traveled north, and as they were traveling north in the car, they were hearing on the car radio that there was a missing aircraft, and when they got almost to the border, they could see lights the other side of the border as people were searching. This plane had come down, several miles inland on a piece of land, and it was found eventually by 17-year-old Ronnie Cook, who discovered this, went off to try and get help. Help, of course, was round about the border, and immediately people started going across the land any way they could. There was mud, they were probably making all kinds of track marks, but they got eventually to the site. And the tail section was missing from the aircraft, a whole wing was missing, and there was moaning. inside. Now, what I've been told is that headlights were shone on that rear section so that Dr. Ritter could go inside. He went inside, checking on all the patients, clearly realizing that they were all deceased, but there was moaning. And one young man was found, Takahito Nakano was his name, and he was immediately brought to a waiting ambulance and brought up to Centerville, to the hospital, to be taken care of, but I'm afraid internal injuries eventually brought the end of Takahiko Nakano. What else do we know? We know everybody in that flight was deceased. And for the next months, we have the FBI coming in, and leading the FBI is Mr. Mark Felt, who many people will remember from Watergate was known as Deep Throat. He was then in charge of the FBI in Kansas City. So the FBI team from Kansas City comes in, the Civil Aeronautics Board from Washington, D.C. comes in, and now they are exploring to find out if and what exactly had brought the flight down. We also know that Dr. Charles Judd was immediately contacted. He's the very popular doctor of Unionville. But Dr. Judd arrived there, you see, quite late, because he arrived there at the point that Takahiko Nakano was being moved in the actual ambulance and brought up to Centerville. And there were more ambulances, all from Centerville, because Centerville is a place that knew about what had happened. They were also waiting to take any victims. And Dr. Ritter, being known exactly what to do, had already set up a morgue in what is now known as the bus building in Centerville. So there was a morgue had already been prepared and was partly underway of being prepared. So the obvious thing to Dr. Ritter was that the bodies would continue going up to Centerville. And that's when Dr. Judd stepped forward. And this is the point where relations between the people of Abenus County and the people of Unionville, I'm afraid then they began to deteriorate a little bit, because Dr. Judd stepped forward and he said, if you take those bodies across the state line, you're in trouble. And of course, he's completely right. But Ritter, facing this situation inside, just said, look, we've got the morgue ready. You don't have the morgue. Why don't we just take them across the border? And it's that point that the Sheriff Fowler stepped forward and he said, I'll shoot your tires out. And it was Thomas Eagleton, who many of you will remember if you know your history. He was chosen as the running mate to Mr. McGovern, and he told Dr. Judd the bodies remain in Missouri. So Dr. Judd was now faced with creating a morgue in Unionville, which he immediately did, and the people of Unionville turned out to help to put that morgue in place. The FBI and Continental Airlines officials were making exact orders of how to organize the morgue. And of course, autopsies had to be performed on significant people that could be involved. But the biggest problem was to identify each one of the victims. Sometimes that was easy. And I found out from National Guard's workmen that were working in there that many of the people on that flight were not injured in any way. Their bodies were very slack for them to pick up. They were easy then to identify. Sometimes they had identifying material in their pockets, but there were about 6 or 7 that were very badly injured, and I'm afraid that is rather unpleasant to read the details of that. But what the FBI had were highly specific trained agents, and they came in immediately before it was barely light. They had arrived in wherever the morgue was, and by now this time it was being set up in Unionville. They came up with fingerprints of the major victims. A lot of them, of course, had been in the Second World War. They had been fighting in Korea. They had military records, and of course the military have got fingerprint records. They had already found them, and they also found the hidden ones. 6 of the people on that flight, for example, didn't have fingerprint records, but the FBI team had already gone to homes and got the image of a fingerprint, perhaps off a perfume body. Now, the perfume was only one woman passenger on that flight. And I think you, Lisa, wanted to ask me a question about the number of people on the flight, didn't you?
Yeah, how many people actually lost their life on that flight?
There were 45 people on that flight. 8 of those were the crew. And of course, all of them eventually lost their life. What we also know is they started counting the bodies inside the morgue. And suddenly they realized that they were 12 short. And eventually, because of course the Continental Airlines had the passenger list, so immediately out goes Dr. Judd and a helicopter pilot with him, and they start locating 12 bodies that had fallen out of the rear end, out of the tail section of the aircraft. They brought all those bodies in for identification and some of them to be autopsied. They counted the bodies again and they still found one was missing. And this was one of the flight attendants. They found her, if you drive up Highway 5 from Unionville, you will see what was a little park on the left-hand side. I think it now has been bought by a religious community, but she was found there in the long grass, and it was kids, students in high school classes in northern Missouri, mainly Unionville. They were asked, seniors, juniors, even sophomores if they wanted to go, and they were all males that were chosen, and they held hands, and they met right up near the border at the Black House Kettle Cafe and the Shields gas station, and in a planned walk, both the Appanoose County people had their group of people to walk, and they were walking back through Appanoose County on that 40 miles trail to find if this one victim remained there. But the other high school kids, all holding hands, moving around that part where the crash site was, they located this one flight attendant. They immediately took her and they took her into the morgue. And it was at this point that many people wanted the bodies released. 2 of the men on the flight, by the way, were of the Jewish faith. And of course, there have got to be very strict rules observed, all of which was being done. And 2 of the lawyers in Centerville, who happened to have a family connection to these 2 men, they came down from Centerville and helped those 2 Jewish bodies be removed. Actually, they went before the other bodies were removed. One man, his name was Goldberg, he was flown right up to New York City, where he was from, and the other young man was from Kansas City. In fact, 33 of those 45 people on board were from Kansas City, and I've managed to find out quite a lot about them. I'd love to know more. However, in the morgue itself, they managed to identify the young woman who had died, and her body was now, this is the one they found 2 or 3 days later, and they flew her body down to Texas for her burial. And the FBI had contacted the U.S. Army. They'd flown in top-notch pathologists, and these top-notch pathologists did, Dr. Judd told me just watching them work was a privilege. And Dr. Judd, by the way, hardly slept. He was watching, he was the main one in charge. And we know that Mark Felt, Deep Throat, kept turning to him and saying, well, you're in charge of this. You tell us what to do next. What moves can we make next? So Dr. Judd got tremendous recognition from all the teams that had gone in there. This one woman, this young woman, was flown down for burial at her home in Texas, and some of those pathologists followed that flight. And they identified her body. They x-rayed it down in Texas. They found shrapnel in her body, little pieces of metal all over her body. And Dr. Judd had kept saying when he saw her body, he kept telling the pathologist here back in Unionville, there's a mark on her arm. That mark is, what is it? He said, it's not the same as everything else. Well, when they got this body down, the pathologist examined that spot on her arm, and they put in tweezers and pulled out a piece of card. And the card was brownish, sort of a brownish grey in colour. It was quite small, and on it were 2 black letters that they could see quite formally. And then what the 2 letters were, the letters D and the letter, part of a letter A. And the interesting thing is that the FBI officers, and they had crawled on their hands and knees across the separation spot where that piece had come down, where that whole aircraft had come down so damaged. They crawled on their hands and knees, and they found another piece of card. And of course, what was the card identifying? They didn't say in the articles I was reading, but eventually the FBI take over at this point. They know that this is not a storm or bad weather that has brought it down. It's an act of some sort of violence, but they didn't know what. The FBI, now under Mark Felt Deep Throat, take over the whole operation in Kansas City office. They go to the homes of every family they could find. They went and tried to find out. Now, they already had suspicion about passenger number 9 and passenger number 10. They had got on the flight late. They had been carrying a briefcase, and by the way, it's Gabe Rasky from Centerville who found that briefcase that was lying on that 40-mile trek I told you of all this damage. So what do we know? We know the FBI went everywhere. They were already looking at number 9. He had taken out, a lot of the people on the flight had taken out insurance, but he'd taken out 3 or 4 times the amount of everybody else and had done it for several days, making all the insurance claims to be payable to his wife, Naomi. So what do we know? The FBI toured Kansas City. They found out about number 9. His name was Thomas Doty. And they found how he had been, for example, in his workplace. What was his record? They interviewed his doctor. What did the doctor say? They knew at 16, Thomas Doty had been identified as a severe diabetic, and he had never properly taken care of it. So what do we know? We know the FBI did the tracking, the trailing. They realized now it was dynamite that had taken this, thanks to those little cards that they'd pulled out of the young woman's arm and the one they had found themselves. And what they now did was break through to the cause of the whole event came with Special Agent Rita S. Pond had the great breakthrough. He went to the Pearson Terry Trading Post on Leavenworth Road in Kansas City, and he asked the people running it, had somebody been in there and bought dynamite? They went through the records, those 3 people. It was a mother, father, son operation. They went through all the records and found, yes, 2 weeks previously, somebody had been in there and had bought 6 sticks of dynamite, 3 blasting caps, 6 feet of orange wax clover safety fuse. The cost that had brought this aircraft and killed 45 people on board, $2.19 and 5 cents in tax.
I know that there was a movie that was inspired by this event. Can you tell us about that?
Actually, it was an English-Canadian-American writer by the name of Arthur Haley. And Arthur Haley wrote a novel which was tremendous bestseller, and he read all the details, even put, of course it didn't end up quite the way with a disaster, everybody on board. There was disaster just for the bomber who'd gone to the rear right restroom and planted dynamite. In the novel and in the movie, he alone gets blown out of the aircraft. But that isn't the way this ended. This ended with 45 deaths, and it's about time the nation did something about this story.
Thank you so much, Enfys, for joining us today.